conversation from our wonderful Sharon Gray. Sharon always talks about expertise and experience of others, and she's got lots of it to share with us this evening. She's going to be sharing how settings can interweave ideas about trauma and adversity into the fabric of our organisations. Wow, that sounds great, doesn't it? And I know Sharon's keen, if you're keen, to follow up with further sessions over the next few months. So please give us that feedback. So thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Sue, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen and just hoping that I'm sharing the right screen, because that could be terribly embarrassing. Well, no, it wouldn't, because I've got nothing to be embarrassed about, but a little bit interesting if I got the wrong screen. So I think I've met quite a few of you before, but for those that don't know me, my name is Sharon Gray, and I was a head teacher myself for about 20 years, the majority of that time working in special schools, supporting those children who are experiencing significant social, emotional and mental health difficulties, whose needs hadn't been met in the mainstream setting and so had been moved on into those settings. I spent about 16 years in those settings and then went into mainstream. I think I got the job that I got in my mainstream school as a result of my experiences in SEMH. I think they felt that they needed someone who could come in and really support the behaviour of the children with whom we were working at that time. The school had gone into special measures. I was very lucky to get the job, but when I realised on going into that setting, it actually wasn't necessarily the behaviour of the children that we really needed to focus on. It was the behaviour of the staff. And I'm going to talk into that a little bit. So with that experience and being taught by the most amazing children with whom I worked over those years, and of course the staff teams, I went into independent consultancy. And my work now is all about authentic inclusion, supporting schools, also a member of the Youth Justice Board with strategic oversight for education in custody, but also to develop what will be our first secure school. As we know, the current custodial system for our children is ineffective. It's punitive, it's sanction-based. It doesn't help our children to go on and find success and achieve in later life. So developing what will be the first secure school based on a really trauma-informed, trauma-reduced approach. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, in the sense of looking forward into how that school will be developed by looking back into what was successful in the schools I've been lucky enough to work in and alongside, in terms of facilitating really authentic, wholesome, wholehearted, trauma-sensitive and responsive schools. So this is just a small part of the journey that I'm going to be talking through this evening. And as Sue has mentioned, if you are interested, I'd be more than happy to come back and talk about some of the other steps that we just simply won't have time to talk about this evening. So there'll be an overview of an introduction to trauma and an overview about the introduction to trauma sensitivity and what that means, being sensitive and responding to trauma, as opposed to exacerbating or traumatizing our children and the adults with whom we're working. The phases of the development in the settings that it's been most successful in developing this type of approach, you can see here. The first phase was really about supporting staff development to understand a little about trauma, the neuroscience of learning, and the biology of stress, which I'm sure, I think lots of you have heard me talk about before. Then into phase 2, about creating that safe and supportive environment. When I talk about a safe and supportive environment, of course, it's about not having slip hazards. It's about removing the sharp objects that might hurt. But equally as importantly, if not more importantly, it's how do we facilitate through relational connection a sense, a neuroception, a felt sense of safety in the bodies of our children, our staff, and our wider communities. And as a result of that, how do we accurately lean in with curiosity to start to identify the needs of our young people, our children, but equally, again, our wider community and ourselves, our staff teams as well. And as a result of having that sort of accurate identification, really reflecting quite strategically how we can really build those social and emotional skills self-awareness skills in the adults, self-awareness skills in the children, self-awareness of being that superpower that precedes self-regulation. In terms of self-awareness, we can meet sort of, if we are not regulated ourselves, it's almost impossible to regulate somebody else. As we say, a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child. So how do we develop those skills within ourselves and within our children? How do we incorporate families and carers, and then finally to reflect the practice, the updated, the strengthened practice, adapt that into policies and procedures. I'm talking about rising strong, reconnection to recovery and resilience, knowing that almost there's that sort of real resilience can't necessarily be taught. Resilience is developed as a result of adversity and ruptures in strong, enabling relationships where reparation can take place. And that awareness is absolutely the fundamental core to developing trauma-informed, sensitive and responsive environments. We know, as Bruce Perry says, somebody that I absolutely adore and love all of his work and his books, the more healthy relationships a child has, a person has, the more likely he, she, they will recover from trauma. Relationships are the agents of change and the most powerful neuroceptive almost regulator and healer. So how can we use what actually costs nothing in our school? We have the capacity there already with the staff to start that healing process. And we may think, why? You know, for goodness sake, emotional health and well-being, isn't that a health issue? That's for somebody else. But we know it's that drip, drip, drip about relational support that forms the most protective instigator, container, emotional container for our children and our adults. And so what we can do in schools, given the amount of time that we're all spending there, can make a significant difference. We are almost the neurosculptures of the brains of our children and ourselves as we facilitate experiences for them alongside relationships, which takes those neurons in those sort of almost dangling neurons at birth to be connected, the synaptic connections as a result of the relationships and experiences. And we know that something hasn't gone quite so well in terms of how our school systems are supporting some of our most vulnerable children. And as a result of that, maybe in some settings, that neuronal sculpturing that's going on unconsciously might not be as effective as we'd hope. And of course, we've all experienced a pandemic, and that in itself has impacted quite significantly. And now we're looking at the events that are happening in Ukraine. That's all going to impact upon the mental health and well-being of all of our stakeholders in school settings. I always come back to start with the document Future in Mind, because I think this was the real starting point for us nationally, many years ago, 2014, to look at the prevalence of emotional health and wellbeing difficulties for children. And at that stage, we started to realise, you know, that in an average class of 33 children had a mental health disorder. We now know that's increased absolutely significantly. So this is everybody's business. This is what schools can do, not by adding another intervention, not by almost getting a glass with lots of pebbles representing interventions and strategies. What we're doing is it's almost the water in that glass. We're colouring it. So we're looking at the ethos and the culture in a slightly different way to support emotional health and well-being. And for me, it's about being evidence-based as to why this is an absolute necessity. Something that I've been very interested in following in terms of Oxford University's research started in the first month of the pandemic, the impact that this was having with children and families throughout the entire pandemic to date. Each month, questionnaires for children being taken. I've popped this on here because they're continuing this research. And if you're interested to get involved, they're very much looking out for schools just to kind of be involved in terms of collating this information to see what's happening for our children. And so the information that they gathered published in 2020 and has recently been published again, was looking at the prevalence now, what's happening to our children as a result of the pandemic. And we can't not look at this when we're thinking about our clarity of explanation as to why we need our schools to be trauma informed. And what the study here shows is how children responded throughout the periods of lockdown. And interestingly, what you see here, in terms of mental health symptoms, so in terms of those difficulties measured by the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, as children were living through each period of the lockdown, issues increased in terms of their emotional health and well-being, but as they returned into their school settings, they started to diminish somewhat. Again, really evidencing about the protective factor of our children being in school. What I find really interesting, and I'm sure will come as no surprise to you, that those children who had special educational needs, and those children, our pupil premium children, or those children who were in circumstances of poverty, who were vulnerable at the starting point of this research, continued to be our most vulnerable children. And the reality is that where they continued, where they started to be vulnerable, as time has progressed, they've become even more vulnerable. So again, it's really looking out for those children so that we can preempt and prevent, support, anticipate their needs and plan for so that we can welcome them back into our settings effectively. What you can see also is that secondary age children quite quickly in mainstream settings quite quickly settle back into schools. What this research really is still continuing to show, it's our students in primary schools that seem to be taking a little bit longer. And the sort of the evidence behind this appears to be that parents found the home learning quite tricky when they were juggling that with jobs and other aspects of life, because the children were far more dependent because of their age and stage on the support of their parents. So again, it's looking at which children do we really need to look out for, and if we can support and meet the needs of those most vulnerable, we'll be supporting the entirety. What's good for these children is good for all of our children and adults. So that information there creates for me that real evidence-based approach as to why now more than ever before we're needing to take whole school approaches to reducing trauma and supporting by facilitating protective factors those children who have experienced trauma. That's the link there. If you wanted to have a little bit more, you can see there the key findings. I'm not going to go through that because if you're interested, you can have a little look at it. What I am also going to mention is some of the charters that have been put out there in terms of support for staff, in terms of their emotional health and well-being, and how staff can support themselves. We all have a responsibility as adults to our own emotional health and well-being, so let's try and support each other to reach out if we need that support. I guess the issue is where we're perhaps a little bit stuck because things are becoming overwhelming and we're not noticing that perhaps we're slipping into a place that's not as healthy. I've mentioned in May 2021, the DfE published this charter about staff emotional health and well-being. It was going to be statutory in terms of the expectation for all settings. In May 2021, I think we were all a little bit too busy to read this, but it's out there and it's got some really nice suggestions to support in terms of well-being for our staff. Supporting our staff well-being supports and enables them to be emotionally present for each other and our children. So just some resources. Also, schools can sign up voluntarily to be involved in some of the work that the DfE are doing with this charter. And again, some of the resources that will come alongside that as well. And what we've noticed in the Ofsted inspection framework amended in September, that the emotional health and well-being of staff, of our children and our wider communities is part of that inspection framework now. So there's almost that lever, really, we can't not look at this. We're in challenging times. We've been in significantly challenging times, and I'm sure there are more challenging times that we will be living through together. It's about this shift in culture. Yeah, it's not about working harder. It's not about doing more. It's about colouring the water of what we do to ensure that we can create the shared vision as we move forward to support all of our children. Some lovely resources I've come across, Karen Treisman, really looking at whole system support. Whole system means every aspect of our educational settings, from the vision to the type of language that we use, into the training that's facilitated. And so when I looked at this, I just thought, wow, that would have been really helpful if I'd have had that at the start of some of these journeys, alongside looking at organisational culture. And again, some really lovely visuals here about the importance of agency, communication, collaboration, and these significant small sort of tweaks in what we're doing can make the huge difference. Now, we have in this space, we have class teachers, we have support staff, we have senior leaders, we have head teachers, we have all staff here who have a responsibility and accountability to lead in one capacity or another. Our own sense of being, working with classes, working with whole schools. My absolute sort of foundation belief is everybody in a school setting is a leader, a learner, always. And how we facilitate a kind of environment, how we feel, makes all the difference. So Maya Angelou says, you'll forget what people say, you'll forget what people do, but you will never forget how people make you feel. And that kind of relationship as we step into this, I think, is fundamental. Everything we say, everything we do, everything we don't say, everything we don't do. The subtlety of our non-verbal behaviours, our body language, all makes the difference as to whether an adult, a child, who perhaps has experienced adversity or trauma, who has not, whether their experience with you, that adult, facilitates a sense of connected safety, or potentially wires them up into a sense of absolute protection. And when we're in that sense of protection, as opposed to connection, we're not in a place for learning. And that's what we're endeavouring to facilitate here. So self-regulation, self-awareness is the outset. Ethical leadership and education. Here we're talking about that wishy-washy stuff, that kindness, that courage, the optimism. But the thing is, we know it's not wishy-washy. We know this is what makes all the difference in our settings. Indeed, if you look way back into systems such as the forces, such as the army, the navy, if you look at their policies over 200 years ago, this almost is pulled from what was said there. This is how we develop teams. So if you're a head or a leader of a multi-academy trust, I would absolutely have this as the core part that goes through the rock, as it were, right through the very middle of all I do. If I was a class teacher, exactly the same. This is what facilitates connected teams to really flourish and thrive. So in this approach, it's that real wholehearted connection coming together, emotional health and well-being, that sense of belonging, connection, that sense of energy and igniting laughter with children, with adults, so that we can facilitate a learning environment for all, everybody involved. Some of the big questions that we'll dance through really quickly is, why are trauma sensitive schools so important? And hopefully we've already answered some of that with that we've just gone through. We know, in many ways, I preach to the converted. That's why we're here. What do trauma sensitive schools look like? And how can you lead your classroom, your school, your setting in terms of implementing this approach? So when we're looking to trauma sensitivity, one of the key aspects is, I guess, ensuring that all of our staff team understand what we mean when we're talking about trauma. What definition are we going to use? And for me, I look at trauma, it's almost defining, or looking beyond defining trauma as in the actual event itself. trauma is really looking at the responses and how it's kept in the body. Bessel van der Kolk talks about the body holding the score as a result of what's been experienced. And then we look at potentially 3 different types of trauma. There's the single overwhelming events, maybe car accidents, for example, natural disasters, sudden bereavements, which many of our children and adults will have experienced recently. These include both having the experience oneself or witnessing it happen to others. So that overwhelming event. The developmental trauma, another type of trauma, describes the impact of early repeated trauma and loss, which happens in the child's important relationships and quite often in early life. Now, developmental trauma has a particularly profound and long-lasting impact because the brains and the bodies of the children are still developing at that stage. And therefore, instead of wiring, as I say, for connection, the children wire for protection. Yeah, children and young people are vulnerable and totally dependent on those around them for survival. We are shaping their brains, and therefore their brains are shaped to survive, to protect themselves. And we see that in the communication of those needs through their behaviour. Accumulated stress refers to trauma caused by ongoing exposure to stressful events over quite a long period of time. And this eventually overwhelms our stress regulation system. Yeah, and sometimes, you know, we get to a Friday and we've managed all week and it's been really, really tricky. And then suddenly there's an explosion, even though we're the adults, because sometimes it's really hard for us to pull upon the strategies in that face of overwhelm. It happens to us, it happens to our children. We're going to look at who does trauma affect, how it affects whole schools, and why, as I say, should schools address this. So we're talking about those 3 E's of trauma. It's an event, but it's the experience of that event and the impact it has, the effects it has on the body of the adult or the child with whom we're working, okay? Now, it could be, for example, a traumatic event could be the divorce of parents. For some children, that might not be traumatic. For others, it might. It could be that a child in our class, their goldfish died. For some children, that could be an event that's passable. We might go and get another goldfish. For another, it might be absolutely the end of the world. Again, this is very much dependent upon how we've been wired, the blueprint in terms of how we respond to these incidents, whether we're used to having, through repeated experience of being soothed and calmed, regulated, co-regulated, the ability to develop strategies to manage the ups and downs of life. And so we can never really identify what might be traumatic. It's more leaning in with curiosity. So instead of being furious about a child or an adult's behaviour, do an MRI scan, the most respectful interpretation. And instead of being furious, lean in and be curious. What might the need be beneath this? We know that a large number of our children, adults in our settings and our families have been exposed to potentially traumatic events. So our children, we might see that in physical symptoms. I don't know about you, but for me, public speaking was always an issue. It made me sick. It made my tummy churn. Physiologically, my body responded because there was this sense of potential threat. And that historical part of my brain went into autonomic response. Yeah, because that part of the brain which keeps me alive automatically manages all my major body organs, my breathing, rest, digestion, all of that stuff. Didn't really understand that public speaking wasn't necessarily a life threat. Okay, but my body responded as if it was. So yeah, I might be sick. I might have felt sick. I might have been quite poorly. And so it's really when we're looking and hearing our children and adults, they might be expressing that anxiety. The body holds the score. And if we can listen in and teach our children to listen in, we can start to name, to tame some of these symptoms that are occurring. They might have difficulties in terms of how they're feeling, expressing that. And as a result, maybe the angry outbursts, withdrawing from adults. So going into that fight, flight response mechanism, survival mechanism. And I know when I was in schools, quite often I would be called to support some of those children that were going into those discharge crisis moments. And I reflect back on my time in terms of how many times was I called upon to go into the class to support children that were going into that frozen place, that potential life threat that they sat very, very quietly, withdrawing, yeah? Those children who seem compliant. So it could be we need to, again, look in with real curiosity, difficulty paying attention, absences, and ultimately some of their behaviours may be unsafe and as a result at risk of exclusion if we don't draw in and meet the needs beneath that. Our students have been exposed to trauma. Our parents and carers have potentially been exposed to trauma and as a result may find it difficult to manage their own emotions. Now, these are our parents who are supporting our children, whose brains are developing. And as we know, we are a social construction, we are absorbing all of this. So reaching out to support our parents and carers to support their children in an effective way, non-judgmental, with our safeguarding cap on, is crucial, not just for the here and now, but for our future as well, because their children's brains will be developing as a result, as their experiences of how their parents are managing stress. Maybe they have difficulties tolerating their children's behaviour and so on. And equally, if some of our parents have had accumulated stress, perhaps because of their experiences, negative experiences of school, then perhaps that mistrust in the education system, difficulties in forming relationships with those people working in schools. So how can we reach out to support? Also our staff, and again, thinking about the experiences that we've lived through. We sit here together looking as to how we can help our children. We reflect just on perhaps some of the experiences through the pandemic, how we feel when we're watching the news, and that with the busy lives we lead, we will have experienced bereavement, loss, and as a result of that, how is that impacting upon our own emotional health and well-being? And how are we standing alongside each other with kind candor to shine the light perhaps when I'm noticing something about one of my colleagues, because maybe unconsciously they're communicating themselves that a need has not been met, or there's a level of anxiety there. In terms of how does trauma affect school settings? Well, we know that where children are experiencing and adults are experiencing high levels of trauma, high levels of stress, it's far more challenging to maintain safe environments because we're getting those discharge behaviours, those real sort of crisis moments, or potentially those frozen moments. We're getting adults and children who perhaps are engulfed. And so as a result of that, are feeling everything that's going on, but can't deal with it because the feelings are so overwhelming. Or we get our colleagues and our children who are rigid. We are going to carry on doing this because that's what we've got to do. So are dealing with the situation in front of them, but perhaps not really feeling what's going on in the sort of emotions of others around them. And as a result of that, creating greater potential for trauma with other staff and with children. We may respond in crisis-driven ways. I'll never forget as a teacher, when I got a bit anxious with my class, my voice would go like this and I would start saying, "You've got to be quiet." And what I found was everybody being infected by my own dysregulation. So it's that capacity to be self-aware, to sense in, and to make a choice about what strategy, tool we can use to self-regulate, yeah, and support our children over time to do the same. I work with the youth justice system. I work with children who are now in prison. They are, as you will be aware, some of the most vulnerable children I think I've ever met. I have absolute respect for their survival mechanisms, because what they've been through, almost all of them, in terms of early trauma, their needs not met or identified, you know, they have absolutely carried out some horrendous crimes, and that needs to be dealt with. But what led them to carry out those crimes? We know that children who have experienced trauma are far more likely to go from that school into prison pipeline if we're not careful, into places where they sense they belong, gang culture, all of those types of things. So really important to capture it when we can. Trauma is in the stress regulation system, and as a result of that, it's automatic, autonomic. Children and adults develop survival strategies that become habitual responses in the moment. Quite often, these survival strategies can be misinterpreted in a school setting. Yeah, so quite often, adults in school settings, and I'm sure not yours, may think that a child is choosing to misbehave, is going out of their way to cause problems. And don't get me wrong, I know in a child's job description, there is mischief and a little bit of naughtiness. And I guess it's in ours as well. However, what we're looking at are those discharge out of control behaviours, or those defensive mechanisms where they've learned a way of almost putting up a shield to protect them from the discomfort of some of the emotions that they're going through as a result of being triggered by trauma. And without an understanding of the neuroscience of learning the biology of stress, what's happening to the brain and bodies, again, staff risk misunderstanding and mislabeling children. That self-fulfilling prophecy, we put a label on it, it's quite likely we're going to achieve that label. So again, leaning in with curiosity. We can protect children from the negative effects of trauma. In fact, we are one of the single most strongest protective factors for our children if they're coming in to school. So here I put addressing trauma has a positive impact on wild school communities. It's whole school communities. And I think it makes a massive difference. We see that in the work that we're doing. So trauma sensitive schools, the bigger picture, it really is that universal approach. Everybody involved here, everybody having that understanding and teaching into at the earliest stages for our children as well. Trauma sensitivity quite often involves systems change. Change can be challenging for all of us. Trauma sensitivity reflects on real core principles that are absolutely at the heart of all we're doing. So exploring that trauma sensitive perspective is crucial. And here we have this sort of very simplistic diagram of that universal graduated approach to trauma sensitivity. Universal approaches are what's on offer to everybody within our setting. So it's the multi-tiered, almost prevention framework that we felt was an absolute necessity, adopted by the entire school to have the broadest impact, as it were. So the ethos, the climate, the culture, and we are all a significant cog. Not all students who've experienced trauma are known to staff. So, and not all students have experienced levels of trauma without protective factors. But by having this universal approach, what we're enabling to do through, if we look at the triangle of relationships, through the relationships that we have, through the ruptures in relationships that we notice, we make the reparation, we form this universal triangle that facilitates resilience. And so while in this universal approach, we reach out to those who need the additional support, and at the same time, we strengthen resilience for all. Resilience comes as a result of us getting through tricky times with people that we are in relationship with. And then, of course, so in terms of policy, practice, what are we doing to support trauma responsive systems? And then identifying, what are we using to identify in terms of social emotional health and well-being? What kind of measures do we have to identify the baselines? What measures do we have to look at how we're supporting and what interventions are making the difference. Quite important for many reasons. One, so that we've got the evidence about perhaps identifying children who need additional support and referrals. Also to support whole school decision making at a strategic level, so that we can really utilise the capacity and resources, the finance we have to support those strategies that make the difference. And of course, those assessments to identify those most vulnerable that might need that specialist intervention. This Mose's iceberg model really starts to help us to see that when we're seeing adults and children who have experienced trauma, quite often communicating that trauma through their behaviour, that's the topology. There is so much more that's going on underneath that. So really important to kind of reflect on, again, that curiosity, the magnifying glass, the detective work that's needed to support those children. So the pathway on reflection that I've travelled quite a few times and observed other schools travelling is really kind of looking at the core principles in terms of whole school setting, community understanding. And these, again, I referred to them earlier, understanding trauma and its impact, a real sense of clarity around that. Ensuring, believing that healing happens in relationships. We have the neuroscience behind that. Emotional and physical safety, how we see students in their most holistic sense. A dysregulated child, a traumatized child is not a child who is in a space to learn. So we need to support them first in terms of that sense of safety. Empowering that cultural competence and working together. So key aspects there, supporting staff, teams, adults to realise there are many members of our community, children and adults alike, that have experienced significant adversity and trauma. Recognising who and where they are, recognising how we can respond effectively and reducing the impact of that trauma through protective factors, and resist responding potentially unconscious in a way that is re-traumatizing. I look back at my past and my teachings, talking to a child who perhaps was telling me an untruth, saying to them, oh my goodness, don't you tell me fibs. One finger away from that. Reshaming potentially. Why is it this child would rather tell an untruth than sit with the discomfort and dare to be open that it was them, that they'd taken the packet of crisps without asking, perhaps meeting a need, perhaps that's the way they'd observed their needs being met previously. Not that we won't shine a light, because that's not a problem way of moving through the world, but actually understanding that we need to do it in a way that's relational and supportive, that develops trust over time. So I've spoken quite a lot, and everyone here in the session will be at different starting points, both in your own personal journey, if you're working in a class, maybe a whole setting, maybe a multitude of different settings. But what I'm going to do for just a few minutes is ask you to reflect on these questions with your own expertise, your own knowledge, and hopefully reflecting on some of the things that I've mentioned. Where is your class, your school, your setting currently, as it relates to shifting from a more traditional approach into being a more trauma sensitive sort of perspective? How big a shift would it be for your setting to move towards that trauma sensitive approach? Have you done similar work elsewhere? What are some of the barriers or challenges, and what might help? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. So really reflecting, where is your setting, your classroom, in terms of this approach, and what might it take to improve, strengthen that even more? I'm going to put you in groups about 5 minutes, just have a quick 4 minutes, and then I'm going to ask you to feed back in the chat some of the key things that came up. You'll get an invite. So if you press on the button, You'll go into a breakout room, introduce yourselves, just a reflection really, and what we've shared and where you're at. And I'll see you in 4 minutes. There you go. If you press on the button, it'll whiz you into that space, an opportunity to share. Have you got your buttons to go in? Not yet? Hopefully. Ah, yes, brilliant. Are you okay there, Susanna? Helen, Joe and Susanna, are you okay? Have you had a... Susanna? Have you got an invitation into a room? Pop in the chat, Susanna, if you're talking to me. welcome back. Well, just hang on for the others to come back in. They'll be booted out of their rooms in a moment. Katie, I don't know where you're coming in from, but the displays behind you are stunning. The artwork looks amazing.
Oh, thank
Where
you.
Where are you from, Katie?
New school, WHSS.
Oh, hang on now. It's quite dark. We've met, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Oh, wow. That looks beautiful.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure. Right, we're just hanging on for folks. Did you get a chance to have a chat with others? I'm hoping it's useful. Let's just check. Well, hi, we're all back in the room. Welcome back, guys. I know it's not a huge amount of time, but quite useful, I hope, for you to sort of reflect with each other. I'm going to ask you to pop in the chat some of the key things that you were talking about. 2 reasons: to identify where folk are at, and also to consider whether you might find it useful if delved a little bit deeper into some of the steps certainly I found useful. So please, if all of you could just pop in one of your reflections, I would be hugely appreciative of that. Thank you, because that will inform next steps for us, and equally for me to have a little look through as I'm continuing through the last sort of part of the presentation. So I'm gonna.
Did you pick up that last question?
No, I didn't, lovely. No.
It was from John Rees, and he's asking, is there one whole school screening tool that you would recommend other than the SDQ?
Yes, and I would say Thrive approach, and it's something that I'm more than happy to talk to people separately. I think many of you are aware that I'm now involved with the Thrive approach, and I've found it at right time in terms of really supporting the emotional development of children at different ages and stages, and also to identify sort of where some of our more vulnerable children are and how we can target in. And I'm more than happy to do a session on that if people are interested to hear a little bit more about that. Equally, you can go for a free awareness session if you look at the Thrive approach. Boxall Profile, absolutely. Boxall Profiles have now gone online, so they're that much quicker. Boxall Profiles are looking at the characteristics of learning, which can be very, very helpful. And equally, sort of what we did at the school I'm talking about, we started Boxall and Thrive and moved across to Thrive because we felt we wanted to really look into the neuroscience. Thank you. Getting some really interesting sort of discussions going on here. And I think the value is in us talking to each other and sharing what we're all doing. It's a big shift when we're really looking authentically at creating our trauma reducing, responsive, sensitive schools. So the way in which we sort of got started, as it were, with this is, you know, that phase 1 in terms of preparation, supporting our staff to look deeper underneath that, understanding trauma, having that shared approach, all staff, all adults across the community, really reflecting that we're in this together. How we share the vision. And I think, you know, I'm a bit of a simple girl at heart. I love something that's visual, that's accessible to all. And so really thinking about how we were going to facilitate this real shift in ethos and culture needed the buy-in from everybody involved. And this is how this path was used in this circumstance. Planning alternative tomorrows with hope. How could we get everybody's views there in terms of what would the vision look like? And what were the steps that we needed to take to get there? And as a result of that path in terms of looking at emotional health and well-being and becoming a trauma sensitive, informed, trauma reducing school, this was the kind of diet that we felt we needed for all adults to really look into what stress meant, what adversity was all about, and the impact of that. That was going to be really important. Now that's another session that I've done with folk previously. And we can talk about that if people would like that, if that's useful. But that almost menu as a starting point. And then as a result of that, a core team was identified coming forward who are really passionate about this type of work, about sort of really supporting, driving this approach in this relational way forward. So from that path, that group got together to really think about some of the core questions that we needed to ask across our community. And so what we wanted to ask our stakeholders and get the voices from our children, from our staff teams, our governors and our parents and carers was their understanding about trauma and its impact. So in here, look, you can see understanding trauma and its impact. How's my school currently integrating an awareness and understanding of trauma from the perceptions of all involved? Here's how I currently, so what am I doing to actually do it, and what can we do more of? So those 3 questions were asked for each of these 7 key points. And it's done in a tiny amount of time in the breakout rooms. But of course, this was done wholeheartedly across the whole system, with all of the feedback gathered together, analysed, to inform what would then become, alongside that visual path that I've just shown you, the stepping stones to becoming what we aim to do would be that trauma-informed, sensitive, and therefore reducing approach in school, which informed then our action plan, as it were, to move forward from there. So having that vision, having that involvement, and having the information to create the foundation of which we would move forward, for us was something that was really important. It was a huge amount of work. It was phase 1. And phase 1 was so important to us because if we didn't get that right, we wouldn't have that secure foundation from which we could grow. What we're endeavouring to do, working with in that school I mentioned way back, actually it wasn't the behaviour of the children that I was most concerned about. It was actually the behaviour of the staff. And I look at that again, not being furious, but with curiosity, as why was some of our staff behaving in the way in which they were? Why? Because they too needed support in terms of their own emotional health and well-being. So we needed to teach into these elements about really understanding what was happening, naming to taming some of those emotions so that we could support our own regulation to be co-regulators for our children. Again, what we wanted our adults to do and support our children to do was actually, if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got. The big challenge was that we needed to help each other to shift our thinking, to look at things in a slightly different way. I always use this because I love it. And I always ask, what do we see? And many people will say, what will many people say? Sue, what do you see there?
Well, I see 2 things.
Tell me about it.
I see a frog and a horse. The horse?
Absolutely. And others might see one of those. But I think, Sue, what I know about you is that you are open to having people sit alongside you and debate and discuss and support perceptive shifting, almost, to look at things from different angles. And that's what's important here. It's really important when we're looking at creating this type of environment. We are all conditioned by our own unconscious bias. And our own unconscious bias means we see what we see, and we expect potentially for other people to see the same thing. It doesn't happen. So if we can facilitate sufficiently safe environments that can help us to see from different perspectives, then what we're starting on is really getting that sense of safety from which trauma reducing approaches can help. I'm going to finish. If we have trauma reducing environments and really increase that sense of safety, we have connected people, relationships, and connected brains. And when our brains are connected, when we're not in that fight, flight, freeze survival mechanism, that's when we can do our learning. It's when we can retain our learning. It's when we can do our thinking. So by creating that foundation for this type of work, what we do is support the scaffolding of a thinking environment. Really key to think about Nancy Klein's work. The thinking that we do depends upon the kind of environments and how we are alongside each other when we do our thinking. I know I do my best thinking when I'm snuggled with my dog Samson. Why?